Ralphie runs college football, at least for week one, and there is a new number one team in the land, or at least there had better be. And are we overreacting to all of these clock rules? This is the College GameDay podcast for Labor Day, Monday, September 4th. Still a game to go as we record this. Clemson and Duke will play tonight. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel with you. Pete, what a week one, and everything overshadowed by the virtuoso performance from Travis Hunter and the rest of the Buffaloes, for that matter, and Deion Sanders, who set a school record, threw for more than 500 yards, and a team that was woeful, by far the worst team in Power 5 and one of the worst teams in all of college football last year, retooled its roster and went in and beat TCU, runner-up for the national championship last year, in a game that sent shockwaves and sent a message really across college football.
Yeah, I mean, look, Rece, I'll be the first to admit I'm really, really surprised that Colorado went in and won that game. And I mean, what a flag plant for a new era, right? Deion brings in 80-plus new guys. There was huge depth questions on their offensive and defensive line. Everybody knew they had some stars, right? And there were some sexy players, Travis Hunter, Deion Sanders. They had gotten some blue chips out of the portal. But my surprise came that they were not exposed on either line and that they just simply never wore down playing the style of offense they play. Hat tip to Deion, obviously the first one. He clearly instilled a belief in that team, in that program, that carried them through. You know, that'll be one of the best games of the year, right? I think we can say pretty comfortably that'll be one of the 5 most entertaining games of the year. Hat tip to Deion for hiring an excellent staff that included Sean Lewis, who was the head coach at Kent State, a very successful one, who brought in a system that TCU had no answers for. And Deion Sanders, I think, showed a lot of development and evolution in the past 6-8 months to come in and really be able to just simply pick that TCU defense apart. The identity of Colorado has been established. It's one of high-end skill guys, a relentless tempo and wide-open offense that they're going to dare you to stop. And Nebraska gets to stop it at altitude this week, Rece.
It'll be styles make fights. And I'm not sure, based on what I saw in the Nebraska-Minnesota game, which is probably going to be one of the candidates for dumb ways to lose at the end of this podcast, I'm not sure I saw enough that they can keep up, even if they can try to keep the fight interior. I mean, on the interior, they'll be the stronger, more physical team in terms of size and strength up front on both lines of scrimmage. That might not carry the day or might not help them, because they're going to have to produce some on offense with all of the weapons that Colorado has. If Nebraska perhaps were a little better, a little farther along on offense, I might be inclined to really say this is going to be a major problem for Colorado, and maybe it will. Maybe it will. But we didn't see enough from Nebraska to suggest that. The other thing that I think you brought up, the fact that Deion hired a great staff. He also has veterans on the defensive side of the ball. And I was talking to one of their assistants leading up to that game and asking him what we were going to see. And he said, you are going to see relentless effort. You're going to see guys running to the ball, or somebody else will be in to run to the ball. And while they weren't always great, I mean, they gave up a bunch of points. They made huge plays. They had 2 interceptions in the red zone. The one by Travis Hunter was one of the best plays I've seen, and I don't remember when. This guy is fabulous. You start thinking about back to Chris Gamble at Ohio State, who was a two-way player, or Charles Woodson, who did some of it, and there have been other guys over the years. But he was relied upon. He wasn't like, hey, let's get – even when Deion Sanders, would occasionally play offense, and I know he did due to injury quite a bit and a couple times in the NFL. But it's pretty apparent that they're going to take this guy, and he is a legit full-time starter both ways.
Is that sustainable, Rece? Like
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't want to be a buzzkill about it, but like there's a reason why this is like a once a generation thing. That's really hard to do. Desmond Howard this morning brought up a great point on our game day call about what his actual total mileage would have been if they have the sports track GPS stuff. I mean, he had to run 16, 17 miles. I have no idea, but like that's and it's not running, you're sprinting
Right.
on both sides of the ball. Like he has to be in elite shape.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the tape, but you know how the old Art Briles offense, if you weren't in the play, you basically, opposite side, he took the play off. Certainly, you can't do that at corner, but when he was at wide receiver, I'd have to go back and look. I didn't necessarily notice that, watching the game, but it was a remarkable feat. And I do think sports science is going to come into play with this, because one of the things that even the most veteran coaches like Nick Saban and others who practice hard have come to accept, if you've got a guy who's exerted a certain amount of energy, whether it be in the game or in early practices, more coaches have become accepting to saying, hey, look, coach, we've had Travis run X number of miles. This is what our data shows us. So full speed, all out. Let's hold him under whatever reps in practice this week in order to have him fresh for the game on Saturday. I think that's something I want to find out this week, how Colorado handled the recovery for Travis Hunter particularly. And I think that will go a long way toward telling us whether it's sustainable. And also, they still have to make sure, because while he's brilliant, he's a young player and he probably needs some reps. So how do you strike that balance of making sure he gets the reps he needs on both sides of the ball, physical reps, he'll have tons of mental reps, and still make sure that he is really fresh for each of your games?
Yeah, I mean, you're almost playing a different sport this week on defense on Colorado. You're playing a team that ran the belly option primarily against Minnesota on Thursday night, and now you're playing you just came off playing TCU, which is obviously like an air raid, wide open system. So I don't know if the Cornhuskers have the talent at receiver that TCU has. They certainly don't have the toys. So it's just very interesting. That's what makes college football great, right? Like this game, I would not think there's going to be 70 points scored total in this game. I think Matt Rule is going to take the air out of the ball. I think he's going to limit possessions. I think he's going to lean into the new clock rules, which we'll debate vigorously later. And I just think, you said style makes fights. That's an elite point. I just really feel like this game is going to test what I was most curious about Colorado, and we'll see how they respond to it.
Two things can be true, as I like to point out. And it is absolutely true that Colorado outplayed, outcoached, out-schemed, everything you can imagine. I mean, watching that game, as you often point out, we don't root, but I found myself not caring who won, enjoying the game. But there reached a point when TCU took the lead that I said, the way these two teams have played, it would actually be a shame if Colorado lost the game. They played better. They played better. I think while it's a great moment for Colorado and Deion Sanders, Travis Hunter, and college football, Shedeur Sanders, great moment for all of those guys, it is also a near catastrophic moment in terms of losing momentum and goodwill that you generated in year one at TCU. That is gone. Then you had the little thing that, seems to hit at certain places a lot in the state of Texas. I guess the players left without staying for the alma mater. Sonny Dykes apologized on Twitter, said it wouldn't happen again, that it hadn't been communicated that they stay, win or lose. There is a lot that went wrong and a lot of things that undermined all of the momentum that they had based on that great run to the national championship game last year. I'm not saying they're going to stink forever, that they'll never win again or anything like that, but you like to be able to take success and build on it. And that's the type of loss that undermines that to a near catastrophic level in terms of momentum. And again, I want I don't want this, aggregated, as you say, and picked up. Rece Davis says TCU will never win again, that it's all over after the Colorado loss. I'm not saying that. I'm saying they really undid a ton of their goodwill and momentum that they had built up last year. Is that fair?
I do think that's fair, and I just think this game epitomizes the thin line we live in. For about the last 7 years, I've said college basketball is a year-to-year business. One year has nothing to do with the next year, and I really think Saturday was a lightning bolt to tell us all college football is now a year-to-year business more than ever. You could argue this started before, and I wouldn't scream against it. But I think Saturday, when you see what Texas State did with G.J. Kinney and 50-plus new players, you see what Colorado did, and then it was always a thin line with TCU. I called up their schedule from last year. 1-score win at SMU. 1-score win at Kansas. Double OT win against Oklahoma State. They had that freak Baylor walk-off field goal. 1-score win at Texas. Even the games in league play. 10-point win against Tech. 10-point win against West Virginia. Obviously, they had that wild game against Michigan and the overtime loss to K-State in the Big Ten title game. Like, statistically, you probably shouldn't win that many close games. It's a little bit like turnover luck, right? And then what's the difference with Max Duggan? Well, Max Duggan doesn't throw 2 red zone interceptions, even if Travis Hunter stood on his head for one of them. Like those are it's just a thin line in this sport, and that's what makes it great. Yeah. It just makes it great that these shooting stars can come out of nowhere and completely change the paradigm. I mean, this is my 20th year covering national college football. Like, I've spent 20 times the amount of time thinking and talking about Colorado in the last 48 hours than I did the first 19 years and 354 days. I mean, it's not even close, right? Yeah. Like, it's not even close. So, and that's what makes this sport great is like the rules are wacky and the business is flawed and the leadership stinks. But you know what? At the end of the day, the games are mind-bending, and it's almost like more Yahtzee right now, where it's just like the variance when you shake up the dice and roll it out is there. So I think it's I think it's awesome that the line is that thin, and that's what makes the sport great.
The job that Deion Sanders wanted and didn't get was Florida State, his alma mater. And while the way Deion Sanders and G.J. Kinney at Texas State, who went into Baylor and whooped them. They didn't just, pull an upset. They whooped them.
Oh, yeah. 42.
They did. But a guy who's playing the transfer portal game brilliantly is Mike Norvell at Florida State. He got the job. There was heat coming around that maybe he wasn't the right guy, that they should have hired Deion Sanders. I'm sure Deion would have done a great job at Florida State too, and may get that job someday. Coaching things change. But as we sit here today on Labor Day, I'm voting Florida State number 1. At Michigan as a preseason number 1. I still might favor Michigan over Florida State, but early season rankings should be fluid and reflective of what you see and not trying to validate your predictions. What I saw from Florida State last night, especially in the second half, was an elite team that can compete on the line of scrimmage with anybody they play. Dangerous receiver play. And as a couple of people aptly pointed out, no disrespect intended to Johnny Wilson, who's an outstanding player, but Keon Coleman was the guy that a lot of people said, that guy's going to make a difference. And he made a huge one. And I really thought that Jordan Travis did a good job. I thought he might be a little he was a little rattled in the first half. And many times it's difficult to kind of get yourself back together and play at an ultra elite level. And he did. They stomped LSU in the second half, and there was no mistake about it. That is what a national championship contender is supposed to look like. It's only 1 week. I totally get that. But you want to come out of the gate and show people that you want to answer that question I've asked in the offseason, if not now, when? And they say, okay, now? That's the way to answer that question. And they looked terrific against a really good team. LSU played poorly in the second half, but most of that was because they were getting spanked pretty good by the Seminoles.
Yeah, so I'm gonna tie together topic 1 and topic 2 before we go to last night's game. Signing day December 15th, 2021. Do you remember who Travis Hunter flipped from to go to Jackson State?
Of course. Yeah. He was going to Florida
Yeah.
State. Yeah.
He's going to Florida State. And it was almost like because Florida State was struggling then, the some of the narratives was, oh, Deion's like stealing from Florida State so he can go get that job. Now, I never really truly believed Mike Norvell's job was in danger. They had just extended him. He was financially protected to what would have to have been a historic level for firing. But I bring that up mostly because this is a podcast where we like to just sort of, you can go down rabbit holes. Imagine Florida State with Travis Hunter right now, where he was committed to and supposed to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, would he be the best player on their roster or not? Who knows? But he'd be one of the three best because he might be one of the three best players in the country. And he was one of the top 3 recruits in the country. So anyway, that you want to talk about a shift that's just reverberates through the sport in a lot of ways and epitomizes the fragility of success and the thin line between success and failure. I just thought that was a funny thing to harken back to as he stole the show Saturday, and then Florida State obviously stole the show Sunday night. But all credit to Mike Norvell, because the first 20 minutes of that game, LSU was a better team. I mean, LSU pushed them up and down the field. Would they go to the red zone their first 6 possessions, something like that? I mean, but Florida State did what they needed to do.
But couldn't finish, and Florida State was whipping them, on the line of scrimmage once they got down there.
No, correct. No, there's no question. And we've talked about this a little bit just because we've had our homages to the returning starts on the Florida State offensive line. If you are going to go toe-to-toe with the SEC, you need quality up front and you need quality depth up front. And I think the single biggest factor in Florida State whooping LSU in the second half of that game was they had both quality and quality depth on the offensive and defensive line. And that is eventually where the game was won. Now, Keon Coleman was great. Jordan Travis obviously turned the corner after a couple boneheaded decisions there in the second quarter. But I really feel like the game was won there. And that's why Florida State may be a favorite at Clemson. Now, we'll see Clemson Monday night. We don't know anything about them yet. And it's certainly, I just said it earlier, 1 year has nothing to do with the next. But man, that power up front is real and is special, and it's going to be a cool thing. And if Florida State does sort of continue on and become a playoff contender, which they are now, but become a playoff team from being a contender, I think the conversation starts there.
It does bear pointing out that LSU was without Mason Smith. Not an excuse for a loss, but that certainly could not have hurt them on the defensive front. And the other thing, because, we've been picked on, especially me, by our College Game Day producer, Jim Galliero, because as we went through our season previews, I would often reference the number of starts returning on the offensive line for not just Florida State, but a lot of teams. My theory in doing that, and I think I might have pointed this out earlier, is if you don't have a lot of starts returning, it doesn't mean you're going to stink. I just really believe in continuity, communication, all that thing. It takes a while for an offensive line. So sometimes it can be indicative. It's better to have really good offensive linemen than it is to have a bunch of returning starts of mediocre offensive linemen. But I thought it was important for Florida State. In the first half, I was watching. I was like, yes, those 200 starts aren't doing much for them at times in the running game. But that's the thing about playing elite teams and elite defensive fronts. You're probably not going to start from the first quarter just knocking guys from LSU or Ohio State or Georgia or Alabama, just knocking them off the ball and just line up, in 12 personnel and run over everybody all night. That's not likely to happen. But if you have those qualities that you just talked about on the offensive front, then you can start to wear people down over the course of the night. That's what started to happen in the second half, especially after they made a couple of plays in the passing game. Now you've chased Jordan Travis around a little bit. Maybe you're not quite as fresh, and now it starts to come into play, and it certainly did for the Seminoles last night. I was really impressed, and it absolutely makes that game at Clemson a luxury and not a necessity for their playoff hopes. They would love to win it. They certainly can. Clemson can certainly win it too, but they're not in a position where they think, well, our season's going to be over before September comes to a close if we don't win at Clemson. That's not the case anymore, and that might be freeing from a mental standpoint to allow them to go in and play their best.
Yeah, no, really, really good point. And I think too, it's worth sort of throwing some roses at the ACC here, right? Like North Carolina pulled away from South Carolina in the second half of that game and was clearly the better team. Your man crush. I know you don't root for anybody, but there had to be some smiles on your
face.
He's
a dude, man.
Oh man, it's the delivery. It's smooth jazz, man. The way it leaves his hand, it's just like it's the way it should look like. It's like the logo of like how the archetype of a quarterback should go. And then like he and Caleb are just very different, right? Caleb's arm angles and movement and like, run around and do a dizzy bat race and then find a guy open in the end zone where Drake Maye is just smooth jazz. It's almost like Eli Manning-y smooth. Like it's just like really, really what it's supposed to look like. So, again, we don't root for teams, but it is fun to have some new faces, right? Carolina, I'm not saying they're going to contend for the playoff, but they should at least like assert themselves now as an ACC contender, which they were last year until the wheels completely fell off. The thing I was most impressed by Carolina was the consistency of their pass rush. That their front seven was a unit that collectively the talent never lived up to the stars. Mac Brown has recruited really well there. They did not play with an edge. They were not gnarly. That was place, I've said it on this podcast, not perceived to be a tough program. Well, they looked tough on Saturday night. Credit to them for pushing on and Gene Chizik for getting that group ready to play because they got after Spencer Rattler.
And you know what? I want to give some credit to Spencer too. I thought he was terrific. He did everything he possibly could. He was under duress the entire night. I thought he really acquitted himself well, and I think he's got a chance to have a really good season. They're going to need to protect him better in order for him to have a chance to pull off, some unexpected wins in the midst of a really difficult schedule for them. But I thought he played really well. Gave them a chance, tried to keep them in the game, and I think he's got a really good future as a pro too. I don't know that I'm totally sold that he's going to be what people might have thought when he first arrived at Oklahoma, but put him in the right place, get him with the right coaches, and he's certainly got the talent. He can throw the football. There's no question about that. So I was impressed with him too. But, you brought up a point, and it's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more probably on Wednesday's podcast as we look ahead a little bit more. ACC deserves credit. Pac-12 and their swan song, they deserve credit. And this upcoming week is a gargantuan one for perception of the SEC. It's not just Alabama, Texas, but with South Carolina losing to North Carolina, at least in the preseason, perceived to be comparable programs in their respective conferences, sort of on par. With Florida State smashing LSU, both perceived to be at the top or near the top of their respective conferences. Tennessee, Virginia, the court will stipulate there. That's a mismatch, in terms of perception. But some of these non-conference games for the SEC this week, obviously Texas and Alabama, but also Arizona, Mississippi State, Auburn and California, Ole Miss and Tulane. And I think there's one other one that I'm forgetting right now off the top of my head, but at any rate, Did you
say Arizona, Mississippi State?
I did. I said Arizona, Mississippi State.
Okay.
But there's one other one. It doesn't matter. If the SEC...
A&M, Miami?
That's it. That's the one I missed. Yeah. A&M and Miami. If you let the SEC drop a couple of those, particularly the high-profile ones, doesn't mean the SEC stinks. Doesn't mean they don't have more draft choices. But it does mean that this perception and this evaluation of schedules as we start to match them up, they don't have this giant edge because they will have lost a number of these games. And that's part of it, man.
Is it a little more fun that the aura of SEC dominance gets poked a little? Does that make it a little more fun, Rece?
Sure. Absolutely. Because I hate when people do this. I can't believe I'm phrasing it this way, but I tweeted last night, it's a big weekend for the SEC and for the people who love to hate the SEC or love to root against them with all of those games. You let them wind up 500, or I guess you can't 2-3, 3-2, then people will poke holes. You let them go 1-4, or somehow lose them all, which is unlikely. But if they did, I mean, there would be a celebration outside of that group, and there would probably be a few SEC apologists running to say, well, Texas is coming to the SEC next year, trying to claim that victory, sort of the way Ohio State people claim Joe Burrow or something. So it's a really big weekend, I think, for the SEC, for those against it, and really for how we should evaluate schedules, because that's what conference strength is about. The bragging rights stuff is fun on social media, but what it's about to me is when you're determining who the best teams are, evaluating the schedule. And this idea that playing an SEC schedule is just inherently tougher most of the time over the last 15 years or so has been true. But maybe that's not the case this year. So that will go a long way toward determining that, I think, what happens this week in these non-conference games.
Yeah, I really think so. And I think that, and we'll get into this probably more in our picks pod on Friday, but there is just a little hint, more so maybe than any time in the last decade, of vulnerability at Bama. And there's a thought that Texas has the talent to go in there and win. Now, again, there's so many variables that go into a game like that: night game, atmosphere, pressure. Certainly one program has responded much better to pressure than another the last decade. I think that goes without saying. But I think there's a ton of opportunity there for Texas. And if Bama loses that game, it really, I think, sets the SEC dominance narrative back for this season some. I also think, Rece, what a cool, in this sort of, it's the end of the world as we know it, like the old REM song. I think that's been the soundtrack of this season. It would kind of be cool to have the world be a little bit flatter in the conferences, to be even in jockeying and not just chasing like they really have been in the SEC.
I think it would be really fun. Again, much like Florida State and LSU last night, a loss for Alabama is not eliminating. It's elevating for Texas and puts them squarely in the mix. And I do think, to your Alabama vulnerability point, Alabama has lost its last 3 games that have a similar marquee value. Now, the national championship game against Georgia, that's obviously a marquee value game all its own. But the other 2 gargantuan feel going into the game matchups, Tennessee game last year, the LSU game last year, something on the line, and whether it be in terms of perception, national standing when they played Tennessee, or the SEC West and a spot in the championship game last year against LSU. Okay, they played close, but they lost. They've lost their last 3. And, I do think it is reasonable to point out that big games are defined differently at Alabama because of the success they've had. And there is an element to their games which may change if they lose to Texas. But right now, it's only a really big game if they lose. I mean, had they beaten Tennessee, had the interception late stood and they had won that game, well, that would have been a great game, but it would not have been a big game necessarily for Alabama. But when they lost, it was a big game. LSU, same thing, because how many times has it been mentioned in the offseason for LSU? Well, they beat Alabama. Well, Alabama didn't go to the playoff last year. So the standard is different for what constitutes a big game for them. But it is also reasonable to point out they've lost their last 3, where even they could define it as on some level a big game. But my Alabama roots compel me to point this out, Pete. The great Gene Stallings used to say, before they would play, I don't know, Louisiana Tech or somebody, Beebs would say, well, if you don't think this is a big game, you just try losing it and see what happens. So there's a point to be made with that too.
That's a great line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Things go sideways pretty fast when you get that. When you step on the rake, as you like to say, in
Yeah.
the in one of those early season games. We'll talk more about that game this week, Reese. But I'm just kind of curious. Big home games of the Saban era, as I go through them in my head, and this is a completely non-scientific, off the cuff. I think of the Cam Newton game. I think of the
Hmm.
Joe Burrow game. I think of the 9-6 LSU game with Les. What am I missing here, and where does this one kind of fit in? Probably
Um,
biggest non-conference, right? Has there been a monster non-con there? Because they've gone neutral site on us, Alabama has.
yeah, they went neutral site and enhanced their recruiting efforts, I think, to be visible in, Dallas and Orlando and, Atlanta and
Atlanta,
wherever else they've
yeah.
played over the years. I think in the Saban era, probably, and this was more because it was Joe Paterno and, Penn State came in early on.
Yep.
There haven't been a lot of
Mhm.
them. And that sort of speaks to what I was talking about earlier, that those that you rattled off, I think, kind of give this perception that they've been, I don't want to say vulnerable because they've won a boatload of 6 national championships, but they've lost some home games. They lost the Texas A&M game, to Johnny Manziel,
Mhm.
went on to win the national championship. But there have been some home losses that have really, really stung. Over the years, and this would be on that list. I don't know that this would quite live up to the Cam Newton game, or probably even the 9-6 LSU game, which they were able to
Yeah, that
avenge,
was
but it
huge.
stung in the moment. Yeah, for sure for them.
Burrow was a huge game. I mean, Trump was there. Like that thing was just a colossal game.
Yeah, I remember working to beat the crowd out because it looked like the game was over, and then Tua and Devontae Smith roasted Stingley for the 17th time or something, and went like 85. And so they had a chance, one more stop or onside kick or something, and they couldn't get it. So, yeah, that was if the atmosphere there Saturday night even approaches that, um, I'll be impressed,
Whew.
because that was, that build up and
Electric.
intensity was
Yeah.
amazing, and a great performance by LSU. They came out and built a lead and was able to hang on to it.
I had a wise college football sage tell me that this could be the hardest ticket in America until the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and then McAfee said on our call that right now, I guess, in some of the secondary markets, that Colorado, Nebraska was selling for more. I know you have fewer tickets there in that venue than you would there, but
Yeah. I haven't looked at the secondary stuff. It doesn't surprise me, right? Like Deion
yeah.
is scorching at a different level. But I think the celebrities that are going to roll into Tuscaloosa, I just think it's just going to be a preposterous scene.
Uh,
Can't wait.
no question about it. So we await the final game of week 1 as we speak here on Labor Day now afternoon. We are joined by the great Ryan McGee, who has divided allegiances in some of these SEC, ACC things, having hailed from ACC country yet gone to an SEC school. So he can give us some good perspective on that. But before that, Pete, both you and I were really, really impressed. I absolutely loved the essay that you wrote and tracked for College Game Day on Saturday, sort of encapsulating the North Carolina-South Carolina feud/rivalry.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think I texted this to you, Rece, because you were kind enough to send me a text Friday night. I've been writing that essay my whole life. We're all in the same age group, but I have, with the exception of the couple of years I spent in Connecticut and the 4 years I spent in Knoxville, I have lived no more than about a half hour above or below the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And so, my first 2 years of high school were in North Carolina. I graduated high school in South Carolina. So I've lived in Charlotte, where you guys just were for the last, quarter century. And so, yeah, I've been living that deal my whole life. And I learned very quickly, because I grew up in what we called, and this doesn't affect how I cover college football now. I grew up in what we call an ABC house, anybody but Carolina. My dad went to East Carolina. My brother went to Wake. I grew up a North Carolina State fan, went to Tennessee. But I learned very quickly, if you wanted to anger the people, in Chapel Hill, go get a University of South Carolina sweatshirt, but get one of the ones just as Carolina on it. And I used to wear those just to make my friends mad.
And so now your daughter has one of those, right?
Yeah. Oh no. Well, my daughter, who's a freshman in South Carolina, that was her first game. Saturday night, I was with her. It didn't go the way she experienced she got the full South Carolina Gamecocks football experience on Saturday night. The energy was amazing. Spencer Rattler, I thought, played great. And they lost a game that they probably should have won. And so I said, welcome to the University of South Carolina. But yeah, my daughter immediately went to high school here in Charlotte. All of her friends went to Chapel Hill. She immediately went to the bookstore in Columbia when she signed the dotted line and got all stuff that just said Carolina on it in garnet and black. So yeah, I raised her right.
Let me ask you this, Ryan. I saw on social media you took in the game from the stands on Saturday. Is that right? What was it like there? What was the experience? What did you think the fan split was? Any good color seen?
It was interesting because it was all very mixed. It was obviously on the press box side of the stadium was primarily South Carolina, the southern half of the stadium, by the way, and then on the northern half of the stadium was primarily North Carolina fans. Very typical that most of the South Carolina fans were in their seats an hour before kickoff. Most of the North Carolina fans showed up as kickoff was happening, which is how both those fan bases always roll. But even on my row, it was about half and half. In fact, my daughter had her best friend with her, who's from Chapel Hill. But the best part was I was texting Stanford Steve, who was literally, I was on about row 7. He was right in front of me. And he's like, what are you doing in the stands? And I said, it's my daughter's first game as a college student. So yeah, it was great. I tell you this though, we get spoiled in the press box, man. Nobody stands in my way. Nobody whistles in my ear. I felt like I felt very bougie while I was sitting out there and complaining because I couldn't see the game.
How did Drake Maye look in person?
He looked great. And he's just composed. I mean, that's the thing is, and that's the MO on his family. When my dad was an ACC official and was first breaking into the ACC back in the 80s, his father, Drake's father, Mark, was the quarterback in North Carolina, and he played very much the same way. It was a very different style of football, but it was very controlled. It's what we saw from his brother in basketball. It is a smart, confident, ability to play football. And then the flip side of that is Spencer Rattler, who I thought played very well, but was running for his life all night. Drake Maye had some time to think about what he was going to do as opposed to Spencer Rattler. But May's just never – he maintains an even strain, man. That's why he's really, really good. I think he and Mac Brown, the reason they get along so well is they're kind of on that same page, And so that's, to me, that's why they get along so well.
What were your biggest takeaways here? We're going to get to dumb ways to lose at the end of this podcast. Any particular gaffes or great moments? Is it that the ACC sort of landed a couple of shots to the SEC? What are the biggest takeaways you had from week 1?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the game I saw. So I started the day at Tennessee, Virginia, and got a little bit of that game. We did Marty McGee and SEC Nation from Nashville. So I started the game on the sideline in Nashville, and that was a very, Tennessee let Virginia hang around for a little bit in the first half, but they were clearly better. South Carolina, North Carolina, I felt like was a push talent-wise, but South Carolina figured out, A, you have to catch footballs, and B, your quarterback has to have time to figure out where he's going to throw it. And so I just thought I was really taken Sunday night blew me away. Like I did not see that coming from Florida State. I've not bought into them. I feel like they're very talented, but until they show me something, and LSU obviously showed us something last year. So the way that game went completely blew me away. But yeah, ACC had a pretty good 72 hours, right? I mean, they staved off. They've survived as a conference. I saw Jim Phillips on the sideline in Nashville, and we chatted about it very briefly. But it was a heck of a 72 hours because not only do you survive as a conference and you add schools, but you win the games. I remember guys going to ACC Media Days at Pinehurst. So, this was years ago. And John Swafford, this was all the questions from the great Carlton Tudor of the Raleigh News and Observer, was sparring with Swafford. And it was all about how the Big East was about to raid the ACC and burn the ACC to the ground. And what Swofford said that day has always hung me with me. He said, if we win our games on Labor Day weekend and we win our bowl games, at the end of December, beginning of January, this perception goes away. And it's stunning, right? I mean, a week ago, the ACC's barely hanging on, and now they've added schools and they won their cross-conference games, and, everybody in Greensboro/Charlotte is very happy.
But that sounds good, except it doesn't always work because the Pac-12's undefeated, right, and they've been burned to the ground.
Yeah, I mean, somebody tweeted at me a brilliant point. Said that the Pac-12 is now like the two-pack. They called him Tupac. Yeah. I was like, that's it. Yeah. So, the good news is that all the we said this forever about the Pac-12. If they would just take care of their business week 1, 2, and 3, and they never did, and now the conference has literally been burned to the ground. They ran the table. It's the most Pac-12 thing that's ever happened.
Well, I really think that this start is a reminder of USC had a string of dithering athletic directors, and then Clay Helton, who's a wonderful man but wasn't the right guy for the job there. They basically took a nap for a decade. Yep. Administratively, they took a nap for a generation. But on the field, they took a nap for a decade. And does this happen? Does the Pac-12 value decrease so much that they have to flee if they are the USC we remembered from the previous decade? And the same thing for, look, Miami's been in a generation. They've taken a generation off, right? They've played in less ACC title games than BC. If Miami's the Miami that when Swofford went and poached them, I don't think the ACC, SEC at least becomes a debate. 1, 2, 3. And then Florida State obviously took a decade off from being nationally relevant, and they're just now reasserting themselves. So if some of these places that should be wired to win and have won didn't, for various reasons, completely tank, I don't know if we have the same speed of realignment that we have.
Yeah, no,
you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think I think there's always been a prisoner of the moment thing. And Rece, I've always preached this about Tennessee, Alabama. When they were talking about scheduling and talking about this and that and so and everybody's like, does the Tennessee Alabama game really matter anymore? Of course it does. I mean,
yes, it does.
Just because and like I know, that series has been a series of streaks. One team wins for 8 years. It just so happens that Alabama had the longest winning streak in the history of the series. But I think we saw immediately last October, yes, the game still matters. And so to your point, Pete, what I have always worried about with realignment is being a prisoner of the moment and not appreciating a program for what it is. If realignment was happening and Washington State had Ryan Leaf, right? Or if Mike Leach was
Stanford had Andrew Luck.
Exactly. And so I worry a lot of times about being prisoner of the moment in these things, and I hope that the leaders are smarter than that, but anecdotal evidence tells me that perhaps they are not.
All of these rivalries too, I don't want to go off on this tangent. Anybody can play if they want to. And that's the one thing I think that's great about Washington State, Oregon State. The plans are to continue to play Oklahoma State has been a little more petulant in their, approach about continuing their series, sort of in the Texas A&M vein, but it's going to wind back and play against each other. So the prisoner of the moment thing is a great point as it pertains to realignment. It also is a great point as it pertains to week 1, because we have decided, I'm speaking collectively here, social media fan bases is sort of natural. We've decided that Colorado is fixed. We've decided that at least there's a fraction of the Georgia fan base and the fraction of the Ohio State fan base who's convinced that they won't be able to score, against really good teams. LSU is that, maybe Brian Kelly is a Yankee after all. You know what I mean? So there are a lot of overreactions. There are a lot of overreactions going on right now. The one that I have is one I brought up to Pete earlier on the podcast, though, and it's one I worry about. This is going to make me seem like the ultimate wishy-washy flip-flopper. So hear me out. When TCU hired Sonny Dykes, I was underwhelmed. I was like, yeah, no, I don't get that. Last year, by the end, I was like, hey, I was wrong about that. Must have been flat wrong. What an unbelievable job. But then after that, Saturday, and reeling, the prisoner of the moment in me goes, well, what if my instinct was right and it was underwhelming and you missed this opportunity? Because TCU had a real chance to be the cornerstone program of the Big 12. Now, Colorado, and we talked about this in the offseason, that the move, gives him a chance to be a cornerstone program. Utah is going to be one. So when you look at the Alabama, Tennessees, Georgias, LSUs, who sort of constitute that foundation of good teams, Florida State and Clemson, and hopefully someday Miami, constitute that foundation of good teams that you can build around. That's what the new Big 12 is going to look for, establish those rivalries, and maybe it's going to be, here's the opportunity for Colorado and Utah to be in a position in a major conference that they've never been in. So the overreaction would be that TCU is not going to be that anymore, because maybe I was right the first time about Sonny. I hope not, by the way. I hope they, rebounded and continue to do well. And the overreaction is that Colorado's got it all figured out and they're about to become a powerhouse, which they might.
Yeah.
But we've got one game of data so far. So, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. No, it's and what I kept hearing from Big 12 fans were like, well, why would I care about Colorado, right? Well, TCU cares about them now. That rivalry is firmly established, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be some heat there, at least in the short term. And so, it's my favorite thing about week 1 is the fact that, I'll give you even week 0 when UMass won, that we joked about last week, but, preseason number 1 in the bottom 10, all the UMass fans, our boy, Randy Angolia down in Florida is constantly, well, we're going to win 9 games now. No, you're not. I mean, you're not. But enjoy week 0, right? And turn the battleship around the bathtub, however you can do it. But that's why week 1. Listen, I was leaving the stadium on Saturday night in Charlotte, and the South Carolina fans have already decided that the season's over. And, they're going back to where they were because, bless their hearts, there's a lot of PTSD down in Columbia. And then the North Carolina fans, and again, anecdotal evidence and statistical evidence, I know that, they've not won a conference championship since I was a kid, like a little kid. And they all of a sudden they're going to go, right, they're going to go to the playoff, right? No, they're not. And so it's I don't think. And so, but that's why week 1's the greatest, right? It's the absolute best.
What does North Carolina have? Minnesota at home, and then App this week, Minnesota at home next week, and then at Pitt, right?
Yeah,
that's a September, man.
Yeah.
If they manage that gauntlet, they should be a top 10 program. They should be a top 10 team,
no question. Here's the other overreaction: we have some coaches who are completely overreacting to the new clock rules. Now, let the court stipulate that I've never been one who said, well, we've got to shorten these games. I like college football. If we want to play longer and play more, that's great. I'm all for that. But, this thing that all of a sudden the game is being wrecked, well, I tell you what, they're a lot shorter than they were before by 1 minute on average. It's not a big enough sample size. I'll admit that. Average time of game through Saturday, 3 hours and 26 minutes. Last year, the average time, 3 hours and 27 minutes. Plays per game. You say, oh, no, we don't care about the league. We've lost all these plays. You know how many plays you've lost? Less than 2 so far. Less than 2. So I said that to say I understand and empathize with Chip Kelly wanting to get the offense going. There's no data so far to support the idea that this is the reason that they couldn't get it going, at least not so far. Now, we'll find out more when we get a few more weeks in the books and find out whether it really does impact and whether we have some particular games, both short and long, number of plays with a lot of plays and few plays that have skewed the numbers. But that's sort of the point. You can't decide that right now. You don't know. I mean, and everybody will adjust and figure out how to run their plays as best they want to. But Pete's upset about this. He thinks that we've ruined the game by changing the clock rules.
I don't like the rhythm of the end of games, right? Like what separates college and makes it better than the NFL is that there is more opportunity for chaos at the end of games. And we can't root for teams, but we can sure root for chaos. And I root for it every week. I want that improbable comeback. I want that extra possession. I want that clock to drag out just a little bit to get hope. I want that guy reaching for the first down at midfield because he knows it's going to stop the clock. And then they can make a substitution or whatever to to keep the drive going. I just feel like that is we should keep differences between college football and the NFL. I don't believe in the homogenization of it. That's what makes the sport unique. So I am against it. I am on Team Chip Kelly in the New Hampshire primary of this debate. I want the old rules back.
You know what I wanted, because the old rules are in effect in the last 2 minutes, as you know, the last 2 minutes of each half.
No, I do know that.
Yeah.
But like, if you're down 2 scores, Billy Napier, quite frankly, bungled it in that Utah game.
Yeah.
He was playing with the pace you needed when you were down multiple scores against Utah. But I do think that was one of the places where it stood out as like, okay, you're down 2 scores here, and the clock's going to go from 7 minutes to 4 minutes a lot faster than it would have before if you could move the ball. Now, they also struggled moving the ball, so I'm not going to overlook that. But I want opportunity. Like, that's what those rules always meant to me, was that you could probably come back from 13 down with 6 minutes to go. And I do think like everything being sandwiched together, even though the data isn't quite there, shows that there's a little less opportunity. It also shows people are going to lean into the clock rules to shorten the game with leads and stuff. So I felt like it had a fairly big impact on the opening weekend.
Officials will always tell you about when, every other year there are new rules introduced, and officials will tell you all the time, September is the learning curve. And whenever we're in a new rule season, a new rule year, it takes about a month. And that includes the coaches, not the officials. They got to be ready, but the players, everyone has to get used to it. But Pete, to your point, my biggest concern, and people ask me about realignment, and they ask me about scheduling, and they ask me about expanded playoff, and they ask me about the clock rule. And my answer is always the same, which is my single biggest concern about all of this is that I want Saturday football to look like Saturday football, and I want Sunday football to look like Sunday football. I don't watch Sunday football. I respect the NFL. I follow the players that I covered in college. I root for the Carolina Panthers because I've lived in Charlotte, half of my life. But the reality is that I loved college football growing up because it was different. And when big steps are taken to try and make it all look the same, it drives me crazy. That's my biggest concern about college football going forward is in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years, will it still look like college football as opposed to will it just look like, the AAA affiliate of the NFL on Saturdays? And that is my single biggest old man, get off my lawn concern about where the game is going. And to me, the clock rules, that's the example. Listen, you guys were at the Charlotte Knights ballpark, right? I'm wearing a Charlotte Knights hat right here, the AAA affiliate of the White Sox. I'm a season ticket holder. It's right next door to Bank of America Stadium where the game was on Saturday night. Y'all did game day right next door. That was
Pat McAfee and Kirk took batting practice.
That was it,
on
right?
Friday,
but that was that ballpark 2 years ago was one of the test ballparks. 3 years ago was one of the test ballparks for the pitch clock. I loved it. I got no problem with it. Baseball games do need to be shortened. That pace needs to be picked. I don't believe that's the case in college football. But my biggest concern going forward is, buys in the playoff, all this. I don't want Saturday to look like NFL, 0.2. I just don't want that to happen.
Well, there's too much of it that's moving there. I didn't have a problem with the clock rules. Pete, you brought up an interesting thing on text about how did we get here? And I think it's twofold. What the impetus was, it seems to me, from talking to a lot of people. One was actual length of game, and let's be honest about it, it was a business model thing. TV would like for the games to fit in more manageable windows and avoid the 4+ hour games, which brings up Chip's point, which is a valid one. He made reference to the commercials, and in the stadium, then the long breaks really impact the flow of the game for the fans if you're just watching that. So I don't think the rules addressed some of those concerns in that way. But the other one, I don't know that there's been any empirical data or any studies done definitively, but they always bring up player safety, which everyone who's around the sport is in favor of. Anything to make the game safer, to make it better for the players, we're all for. And they say, well, and with fatigue, of course, you're more likely to to succumb to some type of fatigue-related injury or not protecting yourself as you would on play 95 as opposed to play 67. That sort of stands to reason, people would think. Yet, and I realize he's an outlier, yet Travis Hunter played 119 snaps on Saturday, and he looked as if he could play 119 more. These are pretty elite athletes, and I haven't seen it, if it exists, the study that says that players are more at risk after play number X. Fatigue makes cowards of us all and all of that. And, if guys are standing up and not in proper position, of course, they're going to be more vulnerable. I think those two things were the driving impetus. I don't know if there's compelling evidence to suggest that it's meaningful enough to have made the changes, but I figure everybody will adapt. Sort of like when Chip in Oregon ran the same play over and over again before anybody could get lined up. Well, then sooner or later, people figured out how to get lined up. And I think they'll figure this out too in terms of the clock rules. So maybe it'll impact the way teams use timeouts when they're down and trying to get that extra
I
possession.
think it would have to.
That's one of the adjustments you're talking about, Ryan. That could happen. You could see a team down 2 scores, maybe theoretically taking a timeout in the 4s instead of saving them later because they want to get it back now. You get a third and 13, and here's your chance to get off the field. Bam. Let's save that 40 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever it is.
Yeah, you guys probably didn't watch the end of BC Northern Illinois, but I did in part because YouTube TV didn't work on my flight because it's like Fox Local, so I could only get cable channels, and that was the best cable game available. So anyway, Jeff Hafley took all 3 of his timeouts before they were down a touchdown. They came back to tie the game, put it in overtime. It actually was a well-executed strategy. And I'd actually be curious, and we'll ask if the new clock rules impacted that. They took all 3 before the 3-minute mark, which you don't see very often.
Yep.
And on defense to then set themselves up on offense, probably because they knew those were the built-in timeouts that they had left.
There were a lot more discussions about, and you always see this week 1, week 2, week 3, but it was interesting being in the stands, but being right behind the bench. Molly McGrath was down there working like crazy, and I just was sitting there, taking notes. But watching the coaching staff discuss logistics, and I think these were the things that they were talking about. There were during the television timeout, there were discussions, and guys were pointing to the scoreboard and talking, and they're talking about how many timeouts they have and what are we going to do. And so there's going to be somewhat of a timeout play chart, I think, going in. What are your scenarios as opposed to just coach pulling a Roy Williams and just hanging on at all the timeouts to take them, to the great beyond with them. Right.
Well, you pick on Roy Williams, but John Wooden and Digger Phelps still talks about this. Yep. Was stubbornly refused to call a timeout as Notre Dame ending that 88-game winning streak in 1974. They had an 11-point lead late. Wooden would not take the timeout, believed the players should figure it out, and ultimately Digger's team won. Greatest moment of his life, probably, because every year on January 19th, I get the call. 50-year anniversary is coming up next year. I've been reminded of that a couple of times. But, timeouts and the use of them, a source of conflict there, which brings us to our wrapping point. Dumb loses more than smart wins. Everybody knows for the last couple of years on this podcast, whenever there's been a major job opening, I've said, go hire Matt Rule. I love Matt Rule. I think Matt Rule's a terrific football coach. But he had a number of things work against him that makes Nebraska home of the cinnamon roll and chili combination. The winner of, or the loser of this week's Dumb Loses More Than Smart Wins. One thing you'll overlook, because you think I'm just going to talk about giving up 4th and 10, giving up a couple of turnovers late. End of the first half, they're down, I think, on the 1-yard line. They've got 1 timeout left. I think they're looking at, I think this was going to be 3rd down. So they're trying to save the timeout for the kicking unit, which was understandable. There was 20 some odd seconds left, and I'm going, timeout, Matt, timeout, Matt, timeout, Matt. And instead, they're scrambling, they get up there, false start, back up, throw an interception in the end zone, and they get 0, which turned out to be 3 pretty big points when they end up losing on a walk-off field goal. You have that. You have a fumble when you're controlling the game and running for the win. And then you have, after nearly giving up a 3rd and 10 on the most athletic catch this side of Travis Hunter that didn't count by Daniel Jackson. And then he followed it with almost an equal catch that did count for the touchdown. And Minnesota gets the win, and it was positively Frostian the way they lost. It was as if the old regime hadn't ended yet. And maybe that's the one. Maybe that was the final piece of penance that the Nebraska fans have to pay, is being the dumb loses more than the smart wins. It probably felt as if they'd had bits of broken chair just slammed across their back and lost to $5 too.
Is Sarah okay? Sarah, are you okay? Are you is smoke coming out of your ears? Sarah Abbott, our producer, Nebraska native.
Still alive, but I'm barely breathing. I was at Disney World during that game, so I was at the happiest place on earth while my parents were suffering and in a great deal of pain watching that game.
How's your grandmother? I know she's a reoccurring character on our show. Her pain has been well chronicled. How's Granny doing?
Grammy was very sad. When I came home, she just looked so defeated. She went through it. My dad said, quote, "I just wasted 3.5 hours of my life." And my mom took down the Husker flag as soon as humanly possible.
Whoa,
so,
that's huge.
tough day.
Whoa.
No, that's huge.
Goodness.
But you know what? We're a volleyball school. So
Yeah,
it's fine.
91,000. 91,000.
92,000.
92,000. Yep.
And 3.
There you go.
Didn't you tell me too that your dad was not particularly positive? Did you walk in? Did you see him right before the end of the game?
Yeah. So we walked in from Disney World with 2 minutes left. So we got to see the beautiful field goal. And my dad just said, "Great, you're just in time to watch us lose." So it was a really, really great day for us.
That's
nice.
Terrible. I'm sorry for that. Maybe no more unlikely circumstances will befall Big Red from this point forward. Hopefully that was the end of the run.
So you're talking about Disney World. I was standing in line for Rise of the Resistance over the summer, and a guy said, "Hey, are you McGee?" I go, "Yeah," from ESPN, yeah. And he said, "You went to Tennessee?" I said, "Yeah," because man, they had a great year last year. I said, "They did." And he said, "And Michigan made the playoff." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You think Florida State, they're going to be pretty good, right?" I go, "Yeah." I said, "They should be at least preseason top 10. He goes, "We're the only team from the 90s that hadn't gotten it back yet." And I go, "Are you from Nebraska?" He said, "Yes." And he just walked off. So
that sounds like a walk.
We need a running.
Go ahead, Pete.
We need a running bit of McGee's random interactions with fans, because it's usually obscure. It's not like you just run into Notre Dame fans or Bama fans.
Yeah.
It's UMass fans.
Yeah. He stomped off, and they're all angry. They're all.
You go right into the souls of college football.
They're all in a bad mood. Yeah,
Ryan is.
I look miserable like they do, I guess.
Ryan is as honest as the day is long, but he's also an entertainer. And I'm going to tell you, I got to wonder if these stories are true sometimes, man, or if this is just just your writer's soul coming out with these characters that you are we embellishing at all, or are these hard Ryan McGee reporting facts here?
No, I figured out a long time ago. I tried to, Pete, we all did. We all made stuff up earlier in our careers, and we all got caught on it. So I figured out, you know what? We probably should just, maybe I shouldn't make up quotes anymore. Is that right?
I didn't make up any quotes.
No, I don't know what you're talking about.
Pete's like, no. Pete's like, don't drag me down into this. I'm the authority.
No. No, it's true. It's true, and I tell you, you'll get checked on it if it's not, because I guarantee you that guy right now will probably be listening to this show, and he's going to be driving the truck probably driving the combine, plowing the corn or whatever, and he's going to go, "That's true, I did say that," and he walked off. Like I'm like, dude, you've been in line for Rise of Resistance for like 30 minutes, and he just left.
No, you can't leave the line.
That's the part I actually don't believe.
You need a drink. Yeah, my man went and got some blue milk.
Oh. So Lee Corso drink blue milk, right? We got to do that ride before it opened, the year that we did a game day at Disney World, which was phenomenal. And they were about to open it that weekend, so they took us over. Phenomenal setup, great ride. Sounds like a great place for us to walk off too here. All right, we'll walk it off, guys. That was great, a lot of fun. Week 1 almost in the books. If you're listening before Clemson and Duke play later tonight, thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. Continue to download this wherever you like to get your podcasts.